Hello, everyone. It is so fantastic to see so many of you here. We are in for a treat today because this book, Renaissance Women, the Shakespeare Sisters, is one of the most illuminating books and also just beautifully lyrical and fabulously written books I've read in a long time. I'm an art historian, and oftentimes, people are shocked when they can't name, 10 women artists from the Renaissance, and these people are household names to me. And when I apply that thinking to your work, and I questioned myself, could I name a single Renaissance author who was a woman? The answer was no. And so this book was just completely incredible. So congratulations, Ramie.
Thank you, Katy, and thanks to everyone for being here and to the Literary Festival for inviting me. I was here in 2020, and I'm thrilled to be back here today with all of you.
So in this book, we look at playwrights, we look at diarists, we look at people who wrote poems, translated Psalms, we look at the Bible even, from the female perspective, these women who are working in the Elizabethan and Jacobean times. So I want to start by asking you, Ramie, what draws you to these women from the Renaissance?
So the first thing I want to say is that I hold 2 degrees in Renaissance English literature, a BA, which I got in 1989, and a PhD in 1996. And I'm a little bit embarrassed to say, but it's important to acknowledge that when I got my PhD in 1996, I had never, ever read a word written by a woman from the Renaissance. That is not a reflection of my choice or of my ignorance, a little bit, we could say, but it reflects the fact that for US students, and this is true in the UK, and I'm sure it's true across the globe, the Renaissance to us meant men. It meant brilliant men, it meant fabulous men, it meant Shakespeare and Donne and Johnson and Milton and so on. But we never got to hear about any of the women. So one of the amazing things that's happened in the last few decades, and it's a little bit like Katy's work on the artists, is that scholars, writers, people have started to dig around. And we've started to realize that there were so many other people doing extraordinary work, writing, painting, making music, and so on. So my personal stake in this is in the writing. And in the early 2000s, when these women started to reappear in print, and it's really important to stress reappear, because one of the most maddening things about this story is that if you were at a bookshop in London in 1615, and you walked in and said, for some reason, I'd like to buy some women's literature, you would have had a nice choice in front of you. These women were actually published and celebrated at the time of Shakespeare. Several of them were friends with Shakespeare. One of them was supposedly his mistress. It's not true. But the point is, these women were actually being read and talked about. People were dedicating books to them. And then, in an event that can't really be explained easily, they disappeared. And so when I started to read these women around 20 years ago, after having written several books about wonderful male authors whom I love, I realized how much I'd been missing. I was missing literally half of the story. I hadn't heard anything from women's voices at all. And that's what drew me to write this book.
I mean, it's extraordinary. You say that these women were present in 17th century, the literary world. But then, we get to famous writers, people like Virginia Woolf in the early 20th century, who actually don't even know who these people are, again, because they've been starved of. And you make us think about this idea of what if these women knew that women like them existed 400 years ago. Tell us, why is it called Shakespeare's Sisters?
Yes, and you've just sort of given a hint. For any of you who've ever read Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, which is one of the most foundational texts in women's studies and feminist studies, there's a wonderful passage, a very famous passage in that essay, in which Virginia Woolf goes on a long riff about what would have happened if Shakespeare had a sister, let's call her Judith, she says, who had the same talent as her famous brother. And then she paints us this horrible nightmare that this poor Judith Shakespeare genius would have been treated like a witch. She would have been accused of being insane. She would have lived a sad life. And Judith Shakespeare would have committed suicide, she imagines, because there was no place in Renaissance England for a woman to have that kind of talent. So Virginia Woolf spells this out for us. And I have to say that as a young woman at university, this was the first thing I read about women's writing in the Renaissance, was the fact that there wasn't any. Well, it turns out, as I've already explained, that Virginia Woolf was wrong. She was wrong for the right reason. In other words, she was wrong because when she wrote this in the 1920s, she would have had to dig deep into the rare book library to find these old copies of these texts and to look at manuscripts. But so the title of my book has nothing to do with actual biographical connections to Shakespeare. It has to do with Virginia Woolf's image of a world of sisters, of a world of women who were writing. And one of the things you just said, and I imagine this is true for artists too, one really interesting question is we can recover these women now and we can read them and appreciate them, but we can't do is reproduce the work that might have been written had they been known. In other words, we can trace literary canons from, Chaucer to Spencer to Donne to Milton to Wordsworth, and we can keep going. And these authors all read one another and learn from one another, and we come to a kind of dead end because for hundreds of years, the women that I've written about were out of circulation. No one read them.
No, it's really extraordinary. Actually, the course of history would have changed. Before we get to these incredible 4 women, who we're going to go into depth in a moment, we actually begin the book with something surprising. We begin with the book with Elizabeth I, who, I often know through painting and definitely don't really understand or knew of as an intellectual. So why begin with her? Yeah,
so my book begins actually at her funeral, so at the very end of her life. And I began there for 2 reasons. One, from a narrative perspective, it gave me a chance to bring all 4 of my women together. They were all there at the funeral in different capacities. 2 of them were aristocrats who were either marching or standing with their mothers. One of them was married to a court musician. He was playing the flute, and she was watching. And another was married to the master of the jewels. So it gives me an occasion to bring these 4 women who did have overlapping lives, but were very rarely in the same room, into the same space. But the more intellectually compelling answer to your question is that Queen Elizabeth I was actually a quite extraordinary intellectual, as you've said. And she had an amazing education, an education that was really fostered by Henry VIII, her father's last wife, Catherine Parr, who took her under her wings, brought in amazing tutors for her, taught her to be a good Protestant, and taught her to read the Bible, to think about the Bible, and also to write in French, Italian. She was studying Latin. So by the time Queen Elizabeth came to the throne, she was already quite equipped as a scholar. And although she had a very busy day job, she was running a country, she managed in the course of her long, long reign, over 4 decades, to actually produce a pretty significant body of writing. She did translations from Plutarch and Boethius. She wrote an original book of prayers and meditations. And then she wrote some pretty amazing love poems and political poems, which were not published in any official way, although one of them shows up in an anthology. But I begin the book there because I want to think about what it meant for women, for young girls, for school children growing up with this remarkable queen who made amazing speeches that were filled with sort of professional eloquence. What it meant to have that as your role model. So we tend to think of Queen Elizabeth, if you think about her at all, as the virgin queen. She never married. She made anti-feminist statements like, I may have the body of a woman, but I have the heart of a man. So in this way, she wasn't particularly inspiring. But as a writer, as a thinker, as someone who showed that women were well equipped to handle the most difficult job in the world, she was an extraordinary role model.
It was so illuminating hearing about this. Now, I want to ask you, obviously we have this great monarchical figure of Queen Elizabeth I, but what was the state of women at the time in terms of what access do they have in terms of education and the sort of illiteracy at the time?
Yeah, so this is bad news. Being a woman in Elizabethan England was to be really, really a second-class citizen. Women had no access to formal education. There were no schools for women, with a very few exception of what were called penny schools that you could go to until you were sort of 7 or 8, so just for very rudimentary education, and that was few and far between. But there were no secondary schools for women. There were, of course, no women's colleges or universities. So the only chance women had to get an education was to have someone at home who cared about educating them. When we start talking about the women I've written about, it's not an accident that they had home educations, that they had mothers or tutors, fathers who decided that for whatever reason they should educate their daughters. So just to say a few more things about the bleak situation for women, just to paint the scene. So women had no access to education. Women couldn't hold any positions of power. You know, they couldn't be in the government. They couldn't have any official trade. They couldn't be lawyers or doctors. They couldn't be politicians. They couldn't work. Women had no legal rights. They were actually under a doctrine called coverture, which comes from the French word for covering you. So they were covered by their husbands. So women couldn't make legal decisions of their own. Women really couldn't do anything except they could write. No one could take away their pen. No one could take away their imagination. And so what we have here in the women I'm writing about is not just, you know, a set of texts that happen to be written by women, but we also have what I call in the book sort of early feminist texts that actually talk about why is it that men get to get divorced and women don't? Why do men get to learn all of these things at university and we're stuck at home raising children? So we actually start to hear these voices creeping in.
It's extraordinary. I mean, just before we get into sort of the nitty-gritty in terms of what access they had and who they could go through, I would love for you just to give us a brief description of who these 4 women were.
Sure. And I should say that I chose these 4 women because it was a sort of manageable number for a book and not to go into too many different people without enough detail. There are probably 6 or 7. So we're not talking about a pool of 20 that I was choosing from. You know, 10 would be a stretch. That said, there are other women as well whom you know, we could be talking about. I chose these women, these 4 women in particular, because they were doing very different kinds of writing, and I wanted to convey to my readers what kinds of things women were up to in the period. So in chronological order, the oldest woman in the book, who was born in 1561, is a woman named Mary Sidney. She came from a very sort of fancy family who were all in service to the Queen. Her mother actually nursed Queen Elizabeth through her smallpox. Her father was running Ireland for the Queen, and she grew up in a household. She actually grew up in Ludlow Palace in Wales, in a household with lots of tutors coming in for her brothers and also for herself and her sisters. But the brothers were getting sort of the good stuff, and the sisters were learning sort of more feminine things like needlework, dance, Italian and French, but not Latin, philosophy, and history. So that's how the gender division worked. Her brother, Sir Philip Sidney, was one of the most famous poets of the era. So I see some people nodding their heads. He wrote the first massive sonnet series in English. He was a dashing courtier. He was killed in military service in the Netherlands, so he was a Protestant war hero. And when he died, Mary saw her opportunity, which is a really interesting way to begin a career. She saw her opportunity to put into print all of these works he'd been writing, which so far had just been circulating among friends. So her first sort of entree into the literary world in London was to publish her brother's works. And then she discovered that her brother had started to translate the Hebrew book of Psalms. So the book of Psalms, there are 150 Psalms, as many of you know, had never been translated into English poetry before. Philip, her brother, had translated the first 43 into beautiful poetry. She fixed up his 43, made them better, and then decided to keep going and translated the remaining 107. So that's her claim to fame. And I do just want to add, in terms of what it feels like to be working on these women, that a few years ago I was in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, and I shouldn't say got my hands on it because I was pretty protected, but I had in front of me and was at a distance touching the beautiful version of that book, her book of Psalms, that Mary Sidney prepared for the Queen, for Queen Elizabeth. It's one of the treasures of the Bodleian. But there you see, what an extraordinary thing to think of this woman preparing the first poetic translation of the Hebrew Psalms for Queen Elizabeth, who is coming to visit at her house. So she's my first woman. In addition to translating the Bible, she also wrote a whole set of beautiful poems. My second woman, moving really dramatically in terms of class, is a woman named Emilia Lanier. Her maiden name was Bassano, as it sounds, Italian. Her father was a Jewish Italian musician who came over with his 5 brothers to London at the request of Henry VIII to play the recorder and flute for them. So they were a famous family of musicians. They had converted from Judaism to Catholicism. They came over to the court of Henry VIII and then settled in London. He married an illiterate British woman. All we know is her name. And from that marriage emerged the first woman to publish a book of original poetry in the 17th century. So Emilia Lanier wrote a book of poems that are religious in nature, but more importantly than being religious, they're seriously feminist. I don't know if you agree with me, Katy. The hero, or heroine, I should say, of her book is a minor figure in the New Testament, the wife of Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate, who decides that Jesus should be crucified, had a wife, and in the Gospel of Matthew, only one of the 4 Gospels does she even show up, this woman says to her husband, who's the governor of Judea, "Do not kill that just man. I've had a bad dream. I've had a premonition about it." Emilia Lanier, and this is sort of a meta story for my whole book, if you think about it, she plucks out of oblivion almost this woman from the New Testament and gives her a voice and makes her the star of her poem. And in this poem, this woman, who has no name in the Bible, speaks for several hundred lines, saying to her husband, if you crucify Christ, that is so much worse than what Eve did when she innocently ate the apple. It's so much worse, she says, that all bets are off. From this point on, women, she says, will have their liberty again, that we should be equal, because your sin in killing God's son so far exceeds anything that women have ever done, that we need to reverse Eve's curse. So that's the second. Do you want me to keep going, or do you want to interrupt?
Well, I'd love to ask about a little bit about these poems, which is the Salve Deus. Again, because, when I read this, I was completely illuminated again, just because of how many times I've heard these fables or biblical tales, just so much so from the male perspective, and how that's almost become the default for us. And when I was younger, if I had Emilia Lanier's perspective, I would have probably seen the world in a very different way. So I want to ask, what was the kind of reaction to something like the Salve Deus?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and unfortunately, the answer is a little bit sad. But before I get there, I want to say that book that I described was published in 1611, which is the same year that the King James Bible appeared in print. So in 1 year in London, we have, the most authoritative, beautiful translation of the Bible in English ever to appear, and then this sort of scrappy, feminist, radical take-back of the Bible. Unfortunately, it didn't go so well. This book was published in 1611 and then reappeared in print in the last 20, 25 years. So there was no second, third, fourth, fifth edition. It's hard to know whether London wasn't ready for it, whether there was some pushback. There's no record of that. But it sat waiting for a very long time.
But it's also so interesting to think about what was happening in the kind of 1590s as well. I mean, this is the era of the boom of the witch trials as well.
That's right. And may I use that as my bridge to my next woman? So the third woman in the book is named Elizabeth Carey. She is the first woman in England ever to write an original play. And her play, The Tragedy of Miriam, tells the story of an ancient Jewish princess, Miriam, who's married to the tyrant Herod, and who's murdered on false charges of adultery. So for those of you who are at the second chances, this is sounding very familiar to the Othello plot. Elizabeth Carey saw Othello at court, probably. We were told by her daughters who wrote her memoir, which is amazing, that she loved going to the theater. And it's very tempting to see this play as a woman's reaction to Othello, and specifically to what would have happened if Desdemona had fought back, if Desdemona had had a little more aggression and righteousness in her. But that play tells the story also of women's right to get divorced, and the villain in the play is Herod's biblically famous sister Salome, who wants to get a divorce she's killed her first husband. She decides to spare her second husband, but says she'd like to divorce him to marry her third. And she says, who says that men are in greater grace with God than women? She says, I'll be the custom breaker to open the door for women's divorce. So that's something that would never have been allowed. I mean, if a woman had actually said that, the massive censorship system in early 17th century England would have had her arrested. And this is one of these moments where you see how the genre actually affects what women are able to say. Because should she have been arrested for that, she would have said, well, that's my Iago. That's my villain. Right, Salome is the wicked character, but she says some really radical things. Elizabeth Cary, though, just to say a little bit about her background, because Katy mentioned witchcraft, Elizabeth Cary was the only daughter of a very wealthy lawyer. So this is a ambitious, class-aspiring lawyer who had no title but lots of money. The house she grew up in is actually owned by Rupert Murdoch's ex-son-in-law. Rupert Murdoch's daughter and son-in-law lived in their house in Burford Priory. So lots of nice real estate, lots of cash, no son. And the father decided he had this brilliant daughter. This was the sort of girl genius of my book. By the age of 5, apparently, she spoke Spanish, Latin, French, English, and English, of course, Italian, and Transylvanian, because she'd had some house guests from Transylvania, and she decided to take it on. So she taught herself that language as well. But when she was 10, there's an amazing story, which her daughters recount, which she must have passed on to them, of her father, who was a lawyer, taking her to work. You know, I don't know in India, but in the US, we have take your kid to work day. So this is one of those things. He took her to work on the day he was trying an old lady accused of witchcraft. She was accused of killing several people in the town. And this young 10-year-old girl sat in this witchcraft trial, watching this. Most people accused of being witches in England, not surprisingly, were old and poor. So this old, poor woman who couldn't defend herself, and the father at one point, asked if she had killed, one of the people she was accused of killing, and she says yes, and she looked very nervous and she was stammering, and the little girl, Elizabeth, turned to her father and said, ask her if she killed my uncle, who was standing there alive and healthy. So she said, did you kill, Richard Cary? And he says, and the woman said, yes, I did. And so everyone apparently exploded in laughter because everyone knew he was standing right there. So it was a weird moment of both being liberated and also being shamed in a way. But anyway, she saved this woman's life. So that was one of the woman was let free, and that was the end of it.
I think what's really interesting in your work as well is how much men hinder, but also enable so much in the work as well. And you mentioned widows there as well, because something that really surprised me was actually the power that widows have. Can you talk a bit about what it meant to be a wife or a widow back then?
Yeah, absolutely. So it turns out, I said before that wives were covered by the doctrine of coverture. You were covered by your husband. Before that, you were covered, as it were, by your father. So you went from being one man's property to another man's property, except if you were lucky enough to be widowed. So the category of the widow was a kind of exception, because widows were allowed to sue. They were allowed to run their husbands' businesses. And we actually know about quite a number of women who ran printing presses in England that they had inherited from their husbands. So the widow was the sort of dangerous category. And several of the women in my book, actually all of them, became widows at different moments. And that was empowering to different degrees. Let me get to the last woman, who in some ways is actually my favorite, just so everyone has a sense of the full set of characters. So the last woman is someone named Anne Clifford. Anne Clifford was also an only child. It's not a coincidence that we're looking at several only children. Actually, Amelia Lanier was one of 2 daughters, but had a much older sister. So, not having brothers around to use up the resources was very useful. But Anne Clifford was born into the largest landowner in England next to the Queen. Her father was the Earl of Cumberland. He owned most of the northwest of England. And his family had come over with the Norman conquerors. So these are really, vastly aristocratic families. She had an extraordinary pedigree. Her father conquered Puerto Rico. It was a famous sort of, dashing courtier, buccaneer, and so on. When her father died, she was 15, and she had every right, as Dickens would say. She had great expectations. She thought she was going to inherit all of what I've just said, and was devastated. She and her mother were devastated to find out that he had left everything to his brother. He'd left her a nice cash settlement for her dowry, but he had disinherited her. For the next almost 40 years, 37 years, she fought back. She fought one lawsuit after another to gain her inheritance that she thought, rightly actually, was hers. It was rightly hers on a legal technicality that I won't bore you with, but had something to do with the way the family property had been set up. It was supposed to go to the direct heir, regardless of sex. So the principle that many of us know from Jane Austen novels and Downton Abbey of primogeniture, that you have to find the nearest male relative. This family was so important that the king in the 1300s had passed a special law about how the property should be passed. Anyway, she fought this lawsuit, a series of lawsuits, for 37 years until she finally won. She actually didn't even really win so much as all the men died out on her husband's side, her father's side, so she gained her property. But the reason she's in my book isn't about the legal story, although it's an incredible story. It's because she decided early on that her best friend was going to be her diary. She started keeping a diary at the age of 13 in 1603, and her first diary entry is actually Queen Elizabeth's funeral. And that's another way why I began my book there, where she was with her mother. She said she wasn't allowed to march officially because she was too small. She was 13, but she was there at Westminster Abbey when she was buried. Her last diary entry was in 1676. So she lived a very long life. She was 86. She wrote in her diary, or had her secretary write, she couldn't even write, the day before she died. Her last entry says, "Thank God I am so well." And then she died the next day. So over the course of those 73 years, she kept track of really nearly everything that was happening to her. So we have, the execution of the king. We have the fire of London. For those of you who know Samuel Pepys, she's really the female equivalent of Pepys.
And I mean, the diary is the most illuminating thing, because while women would keep diaries in the 16th and 17th centuries, so much of the time it was kind of their spiritual life as well. And so tell us about what kind of insights did you get for what women were actually like at that time in terms of their personal life?
Yeah, the diary is an extraordinary combination of acknowledging things going on in the outer world and then her own psychological health. She says, today I am so melancholy. My husband, my lord, as she would call him, because women never even refer to their husbands by their Christian names. My lord is off again with Matthew. Who's Matthew? Matthew is his lover and his steward. So you get, you start to see these things. Today I spent reading the Bible with so-and-so. I was wearing my yellow taffeta dress with my black ribbon. Today all the ladies at court came and told me I should accept the king's settlement. Actually, one of the most dramatic, if I were staging this as a play, one of the most dramatic moments in the diary, which she goes into great detail about, is an episode in 1617. So she'd been already fighting this lawsuit since her father died in 1605 for 12 years, when her husband connived, because he just wanted to end this thing and get the cash settlement. He didn't care about all these castles up in the north. Her husband contrived with the king, King James, to bring Anne Clifford to court. She came into the king's private drawing chamber, and she was in a sea of men. And these weren't just any old men. There was the Archbishop of Canterbury. There were, the heads of state and so on. She was the only woman in the room. And she narrates this in this fashion, live, as it were. And they say they're there to finally conclude this lawsuit, and that they've presented her with a document and so forth, and they put it before her to sign. And she says she looked around the room and she saw there was a door over there. And she managed, and she says God, she was religious, that God, shone his light upon her, but she was just really quite canny and quick. She managed to get a servant to open the door. She says they slid open the door for her, and she snuck out and got into her carriage on the street. So she escaped from that room, but also just imagine what it means for a woman in 1617 to defy not just her husband, not just the archbishop, but her king. She slipped out. The only thing I want to add to that is right before she tells us that story, and right before she's called in, she recounts that Queen Anne of Denmark, who's another one of my secret protagonists, has asked to see her before she goes to see Queen Anne's husband, James. Queen Anne brings her in, and she says, "Don't trust my husband," which is also kind of an act of treason, basically. All of this is in the diary. We would have no access to this. So you imagine Ben Jonson wrote a play called Women Beware Women. This is like the opposite. This is women protecting women. When she gets into that room with the queen, there are a couple of the other ladies, the Countess of Bedford, the Countess of Dorset. There are other women there. And I like to think that they were supporting one another, that there was a kind of network of women who were on Anne's side.
I'm going to come to questions in a few minutes, so please get them prepared. I mean, you mentioned this network. I love the fact that in this book, you suddenly start to realize the connections between them, tutors to each other, but this kind of web of networks that women were sort of connected through time. And I just want to end by asking you, we began this talk talking about Virginia Woolf, and it's actually thanks to Virginia Woolf's lover, Vita Sackville-West, that actually we know about Anne Clifford.
That's right, and this is one of the sort of surprising things. In the 1920s, in 1923, if I'm not mistaken, Vita Sackville-West, so it would have happened a year or two before the actual event, but Vita Sackville-West published Anne Clifford's diary. And it's called the Knowle Diary, Knole, because Knowle is the house that Anne Clifford lived with her first husband. Her second husband was the son of my first woman, Mary Herbert, in terms of all the overlapping stories. But her first husband, whose name was Richard Sackville, who was Vita Sackville-West's direct relative. So in that house, somehow, over the generations, over the centuries, some copy, because it's not an original, of Anne Clifford's earliest diaries from 1603 to 1619 had survived. It fell into the hands of Vita Sackville-West, who found it as compelling as I do. And she wrote a beautiful essay as a preface, and she said, I feel Lady Anne, they called her Lady Anne, I feel Lady Anne's northern spirit. Because all Anne Clifford wanted was to get up to the north and recover her property. Once she did recover her property at the end of the Civil War, in the 37 remaining years of her life, she never came back to London. She never came back to the south. She just went from one castle to another. She called it riding the boundaries. She would just ride patrol like a night guard going around and around. But Vita Sackville-West saw in Anne Clifford something, I think, of what I see in her and what you see in her, and decided to publish this early diary. So that's the first sort of landmark publication that has survived.
Yes, although Virginia Woolf wasn't very kind about her.
No, she was not. No, actually, Virginia Woolf didn't really respect Anne Clifford's writing. And that, just to say, that tells us a little bit. One reason all of these women didn't survive is because, the male canon, the march of history, and so forth, didn't really find room for them. They weren't influential in the same way. But another is that their way of writing didn't always appeal to the same taste who were pushing literature forward. So Virginia Woolf, in her high modernist sensibility, didn't think that the personal writing of Anne Clifford, or for that matter, Mary Sidney, whom she also mentions in a kind of dismissive way, was necessarily worthy of ruining her thesis about Judith Shakespeare. So she continued her story. But Vita Sackville-West saw it differently, actually.
And thank God for them, and thank God for you, because this book is honestly, it's illuminating. And when I look at artworks from 400 years ago, I see myself represented, and I think that's what we see in these translated psalms, in these diaries.
I just want to make one art historical point just to connect, and then we'll go to questions, which is that when Anne Clifford finally won her inheritance battle, when all the men died, she couldn't actually travel to the north. She was locked up in London, in her castle in London, because there were battles going on. I mean, most of her castles required massive renovations, which she took on personally. But she decided she needed to celebrate. She was a woman who wanted to mark the occasion. So she commissioned a massive, like really massive, not quite as big as the stage behind me, but enormous triptych to tell her story. And the triptych consists of 3 panels, as a triptych would. On one side, on the far left, is Anne Clifford at age 15, the age she was disinherited. And she's standing there with her lute on the floor and lots of her books, and you can see exactly what she's reading, because one fun fact I learned doing research for this book is that until the late 17th century, the titles of books weren't on the spines, they were on the pages. You would actually put a little tag or write, so you can see exactly what she's reading. Anyway, we have a picture of a 15-year-old disappointed girl. That's the portrait on the left. In the middle is a family portrait of her mother and father and her 2 little brothers, who both died in early childhood, one right after she was born, one before. And the mother is pointing at her stomach. And in the back is a text, a sort of plaque, that explains this painting is a painting done on the day of my conception. So she's done the math, and she's figured out she was conceived on, January 20th, where her family was. So this is the moment she was conceived. So we have these sort of primary moments in her life: the day of her conception, the day she was disinherited. And then on the far right, we have her at the age of 56 or 57, my age right now, where she has come into her inheritance. And she's standing very proud. And there are tiny little portraits of her 2 husbands in the background. You can barely see them. Very prominent in the front is her dog, whom she loved more than her husband's, jumping up on her. And so this is called The Great Picture. It's in Abbott Hall in Kendal. She made 2 copies of it, one for each of her daughters to inherit. And that was her way, not just of keeping the diary, but also using art to commemorate herself.
And to tell her story, as the Shakespeare talk was discussing.
Exactly.
In which way do you tell your story? There are so many endless possibilities. We'd love to go to questions, so please put up your hand. Yes, the gentleman in the patterned blue shirt. Thank you.
What an absolutely captivating conversation. And I'm really tempted to ask you that when you were researching for your book, did you happen to do a comparative study of the literary status of women in other cultures? Like India at that time had the Mughals and China had the Qing dynasty. So did you happen to do that? And was there any way that these women from all of these different cultures had any way of correspondence? Thank you.
It's a wonderful comment, and I do think it's so important to say, I think this kind of book can be written for so many countries. I'm sure is being written for so many countries. My expertise is European literature. So what I can say very briefly is that the book I wrote before this, that was mentioned before, Renaissance Woman, is a story, it's a biography of the first woman poet in Italy, which is a fascinating story of its own. She was Michelangelo's best friend. She launched a kind of revolution in women's writing. Queen Elizabeth, when she was a princess, her first known work that we have is a translation of the French Queen Marguerite de Navarre, who was an amazing scholar and writer and poet herself. It's a translation of her poem, which the Princess Elizabeth gave to her stepmother, Queen Catherine Parr. So there are networks of women who knew one another and were reading each other within Europe. It would be wonderful to know if they actually, as the colonial project expanded, when and how they came into contact with people here. But I haven't had the opportunity to study that yet. There are a couple of hands in the back.
Yes, the yellow jacket. Thank you.
And up here too.
Hello, ma'am. I would like to ask that the movies or series should be re-released to empower the women in the field of literature, because somewhere the women have stopped themselves in the household chores and all, and they are unable to lift up themselves to embark in the literature field. So do you agree on this, that these should be done?
I think we both agree. Is that fair? We're
Definitely.
with you. We definitely agree.
Thank you.
Yes, in the white shirt. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Hello.
How do you think the style of writing of women has changed over the years, maybe in regard with the opportunities available now?
For sure. I mean, there's of course, as you know, there's a wide variety of women's writing from the period things have really changed. What I would say that shocked me when I was reading all of these women was how much I could kind of connect to and hear their voices, that these are not just stiff translations of biblical texts, for example, even in that, which would be our sort of most, staid, conservative form. Mary Sidney found ways to find every opportunity within the Psalms to think about the women's perspective. How did Solomon's bride feel when she was ripped away? So in the Hebrew Psalm, it says a psalm of joy when this young Egyptian princess is being taken away from her home. And Mary Sidney dwells on her homesickness, what it felt like for her. So I do think our style has changed, of course, with every generation, but I do think you can still get access to and hear things that feel as if they could have been written yesterday.
The lady in the red dress, thank you. In the middle, yeah.
Thank you. A century later, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu talked about the importance of hiding your intelligence and your learning, and leaving it like gold useless as gold in a mine. How well received was such works at the time in the period that you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question, and competing with the works I'm talking about were lots of sort of domestic treatises that were being written about how to be a good wife. One interesting example of one of my writers is Elizabeth Carey, when her husband is off fighting in Spain against the Catholics in one of these Protestant wars that were ongoing. Her mother says, don't write these letters to your husband because you seem too smart. You need to tone it down. So they actually asked a servant to write the letters, and she would recopy them so that she wouldn't intimidate her husband. So there was actually quite a bit of anxiety about overly clever women. At the same time, some of the works I'm describing were actually extremely well received. The best received works, however, were then reprinted, like the Psalms and like another work of Elizabeth Carey's that we didn't talk about, The History of Edward II. When they were reprinted, really more than 100 years later, it was attributed to either their husband or their brother. And people said things like, there's no way a woman could have written this. It must have been her husband. So it was a tough road, absolutely.
Okay, final question at the back in the white.
Good afternoon, ma'am. I just wanted to know that why the works of these female authors were not, it was not in any of the history of literature that we have studied. Was it a deliberately maneuvered act, or was it or are their works overshadowed by the dazzle of Shakespearean, halo? I just wanted to know that.
It's the $1 billion question. What happened? And I remember walking through the Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey 5 or 10 years ago, and the first woman there was from the era of Jane Austen. It was Fanny Burney. And it's not that all the men were at the caliber of Shakespeare. There were minor poets, that I, as a expert in the field, have barely read, who were being recognized. So it's not that they were overwhelmed by male genius. It has something to do, and this is part of a much bigger story, with why underrepresented, underprivileged people, whether it's on race or gender or any class, why their voices aren't being pushed forward. These women were simply not republished. The reason we know so much, for example, about Elizabeth Carey, we know a lot about her, it's because she had 5 daughters who decided to write her memoir. If she hadn't had daughters, we probably would know nothing about her. So it's sadly the case that women were sort of promoting women, trying to promote one another, and that for whatever reason, much larger than the time we have, they faded away until feminism, until the late 20th century.
Ramie Targoff, thank you so much. Ramie will be signing books of this fantastic book in the bookshop. Please come find her, ask more questions, and a huge thank you to writing this book and for being
Thank you all for coming.
Today. Thank you.